This week, New York Times Magazine staff writer Jonathan Mahler discusses the 1980s forces, events, and characters that defined and shaped New York City. His book features Donald Trump, Spike Lee, Rudy Giuliani, Ed Koch, and Al Sharpton, and highlights New York's experiences with homelessness, AIDS, racial tensions, and the crack epidemic. Jonathan Mahler talked about his book, The Gods of New York, with New York Times journalist Jania Belafonte at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College in New York City in December.
I loved this book so much, and I was so excited. I've been excited to talk about it with Jonathan. We're old friends, so there may be some kind of code you don't understand. One thing that people ask me when I talk about this book, and I've been evangelical, telling friends to read it, both who live here and who don't, and those who are less familiar with New York will say, why those 4 years, 1986 to 1990? Isn't that a bit esoteric? And it isn't if you've been here, and you know. But Jonathan, those years are bookended by two very inflammatory instances of racial violence. The first being the death of Michael Griffiths in Howard Beach in '86, and then Yusuf Hawkins in 1989. And I'm wondering, and I don't think I've asked you this before, but when you were framing the book, coming up with the idea, conceiving it, were those two events crucial to how you thought about the structure and the time period?
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, Gina, for doing this. So nice of you to step in. It's great. It's so nice to be here. This is beautiful building with amazing history, and a great crowd despite the rain.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah. I would say sort of when I began this book, or began sort of researching this book, I was really thinking about it as a book about the 80s, about New York in the 80s,
right,
and kind of broadly. I'm not a kind of classic historian in the
right,
sort of survey history sense. I'm more of a kind of a narrative writer. So I knew I kind of needed to sort of narrow my focus, narrow my lens, and sort of find the story inside
yes,
the decade. So I think I ultimately kind of came to these 4 years in part because I knew I wanted to cover so much ground. I wanted to write about AIDS. I wanted to write about homelessness. I wanted to write about race. I wanted to write about politics. I knew I needed something that would hold everything together. And so that something really was someone. It was sort of Ed Koch and Ed Koch's final term. But kind of once I kind of had that as sort of the spine of the story, because so much of this book really is about race, the fact that 1986 was the year of Howard Beach, and the fact that the summer of 1989, kind of leading up to the mayoral race in the fall of 1989, was the kind of tragic murder of Yusuf Hawkins. I did sort of start to see those as really kind of useful bookends for the story. So it was kind of it was a little of both. I recognized its kind of the narrative value of these two events in framing these 4
right,
years. But I would say that I chose the 4 years, largely because of they were Koch's last 4 years, and there was this sense that after this was Koch's third term, and after these amazing 2 terms where he enters office at the beginning of the book in January of 1986, as more popular than any mayor in the modern history of New York. He gets more than 70% of the vote, which is kind of unimaginable when you think
right,
a big deal it was that Mamdani got 50%.
50, right,
yeah.
right.
And then everything just completely falls apart over those 4 years. So that I had that in mind, that kind of the arc of those 4 years for him,
right,
as the kind of sort of central story of the book.
Right.
And of course, there was just so much that happened during these 4 years that we can talk about, but it was kind of a uniquely eventful period of time for New York, too.
We will get to, it is, having lived through it, I still, and have been in college in New York during some of that time, you can't believe how much, I don't recall it being so propulsive. But I want to ask you about, we know how the Yusef Hawkins incident affected politics because we get Dinkins right after that. Yeah. And I know you're so interested in Ed Koch, and your first book, Jonathan's first book, takes place in '77 when Koch is beginning his ascent. So how did the politics, how did Michael Griffith, Howard Beach, does everybody know what happened in Howard Beach? I'm assuming, I'm not seeing any 25-year-olds in this room, forgive me, but if anybody doesn't know what Howard Beach is, we can do an explainer, but how did it affect, how did the death of Michael Griffith and Howard Beach, spiral out politically?
Yeah. So just very briefly, the Howard Beach was, was the name for the incident, the name of the neighborhood where it took place. It was a Saturday night in December of 1986. A group of young black men were driving in Brooklyn and Queens. Their car broke down. They didn't know what to do. One of the four stayed with the car. Three walked to the nearest neighborhood, which was a couple miles away. It was Howard Beach, which was a almost exclusively white neighborhood. The fact that three black men were walking into this neighborhood at after 11 o'clock on a Saturday night did not go unnoticed. They were on their way to the subway. They decided to stop and get a slice of pizza beforehand at a place called the New Park Pizzeria. They, while they were inside, a gang of white youths gathered outside. They came out, and the white youths, the white teenagers, chased them through the neighborhood. One got away. One of the three black men got away. One was caught and beaten, and one was chased into the expressway and killed. So this, just instantly became a huge tabloid story, in part because of Al Sharpton, who was just a kind of young activist at the time, kind of ensured that it would become a tabloid story. But it kind of, there had been, prior to this, a handful of incidents of racial incidents, along similar lines. There was the murder of a black grandmother in the Bronx who, when the housing police came to basically kick her out of her apartment because she was not paying her rent, and she grabbed a knife. She was shot and killed. There was the murder of Michael Stewart, the young art student, who's that's a kind of a famous story that Jean-Michel Basquiat painted a very famous picture about. So there was already this sense of kind of this sense of kind of racial tension in the city, the sense of this prospect of racial violence. Racism and violent racism was like a real thing, and it was Howard Beach that sort of took. It was the moment that all of these incidents that had kind of gone a little bit under the radar, it became just a huge story, and all the attention that those other incidents had not gotten, Howard Beach got. And then something really interesting happened, which kind of made it kind of even more newsworthy, which is that one of the young man Michael Griffith, who'd been run over and killed, the other man who'd been beaten happened to be was about to become his stepfather. He was picked up in the neighborhood by the police shortly after Michael Griffith's murder, and he tried to explain to the police what had happened. They didn't believe him. They took him to the site of. They took him to the body of his stepson, who was bleeding on the highway, and kind of interrogated him. Then they took him to the police station, and they sort of grilled him all night. And so he got a couple of lawyers after the fact, And these lawyers did not believe that the Queen's DA could be trusted to prosecute this case, because the Queen's DA had a history of not prosecuting cases in cases involving violence toward black victims, and they told him, urged him not to cooperate unless the governor, Mario Cuomo, appointed a special prosecutor to handle the case. And so the sort of fight over whether or not Cuomo would appoint a special prosecutor and replace the Queen's DA became a whole separate storyline, and it also became a kind of a model of a different way to kind of a power shift, you might say. So sort of politically, it kind of spoke to a new kind of activism, and the fact that like this activism could be effective. So yeah.
And and so Sharpton comes out of that moment.
Yeah, so Sharpton works with these two lawyers. They basically decide that they are going to resist the Queen's DA, where they're going to refuse to cooperate unless there is an independent prosecutor, and they get into a game of chicken with the state, with Mario Cuomo, and there's an enormous amount of pressure on them to just let their client cooperate, and then there's an enormous amount of pressure on Cuomo to appoint a special prosecutor, and there's a standoff that lasts weeks, and ultimately, Cuomo blinks and appoints a special prosecutor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we forgot another, of course, another big event, Central Park Jogger.
Yes.
Which happens in, is that 89
Yeah,
as
that
well?
happens in April of 1989.
I mean, that's, again, that Yusef Hawkins and the Central Park Jogger are how many months apart?
They're 3 years apart, yeah.
3 years apart. Right.
Yeah. A little less.
Right.
Yeah.
But, so let's talk about how that, the political ramifications of that beyond what, beyond the trajectory. We now know, what happened with Linda Fairstein, how did that play out again politically?
Yeah, so there was, this was April of 1989. It was the beginning of really the kind of heat of the mural campaign, which was going to unfold over the course of that summer. The main candidates were Rudy Giuliani, who had just stepped down from his role as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. David Dinkins, who was running to be the first black mayor of New York. Of course, and of course Ed Koch, who was the incumbent, this was before term limits, and he was running for what would be a fourth term.
Fourth term.
Yeah.
Incredible. Wow.
Yeah. And so, the Central Park Jogger case, which we don't have to go into detail, because I'm sure most of you know the basics, but essentially a white investment banker woman is out jogging in the park and is raped and beaten unconscious. A group of young black teenagers are quickly rounded up, and almost overnight, the entire city decides that they are guilty, and the DA's office decides that they are guilty without a shred of evidence, and there is this incredible kind of bloodlust that is really. It's the tabloids kind of more than anything, but also also politicians and talk radio, and politically it appears that that this will be very damaging for David Dinkins, because he is running. Giuliani is already kind of the law and order candidate. He was the U.S. attorney. Koch is very tapped into the kind of the white anger in the city toward black crime, and so he's going to take advantage of it and exploit this moment as he does. And Dinkins is running a very different kind of campaign. He's running a campaign of healing for New York, and suddenly in this instant. The city doesn't want healing. The city wants revenge, and that's kind of the mood of New York over the course of those subsequent months, from April really until August, when the murder of Yusuf Hawkins, another kind of tragedy, kind of turns things around. Yeah.
Right. And was this, and put this in quotes, the heyday of the tabloids? I mean, was there any other period where the tabloids were more influential in the way that people thought about the city? I mean, and I've said this before when we've discussed the book, but, everybody at that time, everybody read the tabloids.
Yeah.
Everybody read, it was very high-low the way it's since, shifted. But was that really, was the readership higher than ever? Was, obviously I think, as I'm saying, people's engagement with tabloids was bigger than ever, but was that really, did it all start to spiral in the 90s? Yeah,
this was a kind of particular window of time where I think the tabloids were more influential than they'd ever been, because of course, in prior decades, New York had so many newspapers, more than a dozen daily newspapers. What had happened now in the 80s was that a lot of those newspapers had folded because of the rise of radio and television. The media was starting to struggle, but what that meant was that the remaining newspapers, the Daily News, Newsday, the New York Post, and our paper, the New York Times, were more influential than ever because they had the field to themselves. And this was before the internet. This was before even really cable news.
Before cable news,
so
right. Because cable news takes off with the Iraq War
in 91. Right after this.
Yeah.
So they really, really held the city's attention, and you had these columnists, Jimmy Breslin, Pete Hamill, Murray Kempton, these people who were, what we now call influencers.
Right.
They had a kind of influence, a kind of hold over the city that no one has today. Certainly no pundit has today.
Right.
And then in the process, I think these tabloids kind of did something really interesting because they of course were very polarizing because they divided the world up into heroes and villains, but they also kind of brought the entire city together around all of the same stories. So everyone in New York would be talking about Howard Beach because it was on the cover of the Daily News and the New York Post and Newsday day in and day out. And then everybody would be talking about, Tawana Brawley. Or everybody would be talking about the Central Park jogger. And so that, I think, gave the whole city a different kind of feel. The city just felt much less atomized than it does now. It felt like everyone was kind of invested in the fate of New York, even though everyone disagreed about what its future should look like. There was just a sense of investment that was really kind of partly a tribute to the fact that everyone was following the same story.
Right, and you also didn't have then, as we have now, or as certain outlets wanted to believe the flight of the affluence flight.
Yeah.
Where it's not, I don't, whatever, well, I'll just leave New York. Everybody was in it.
Yes.
And committed in the way that you don't get the sense that people are now, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. People can live anywhere, remote work. What are the incidents in recent New York history that you think have had that, come to close to having that kind, bringing people together in that kind of solidarity and understanding?
Well, solidarity, and the incidents that come to mind that have held the city's attention, I would say, the Daniel Penny, Jordan Neely case, right. I think, is one that, and in some ways, it was sort of like an updated Bernie Goetz, right? It was
totally.
sort of a subway vigilante story. Bernie Goetz also comes to trial during these years that I read about. Yeah.
Right.
And in some ways, I think that the Columbia encampment story was a story that people were following day in and day out. It's not fair maybe to bring in mayoral politics because that's a little different. But I do think that this mayoral campaign had a kind of a momentum, and I mean, Mamdani really just like kind of captivated held the attention of New York in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. So
I mean, in the way that
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
people like Koch and Sharpton were such catnip for tabloids, you know, he mastered the medium. He mastered
exactly. It's a totally different form of media
but
now.
He did the
but
same
he
thing.
He adapted his kind of playbook accordingly.
Yeah.
But it was the same idea for sure.
And you know, the most famous mayors in the city have always been characters.
Yes.
Like Koch was, you know, they're doing. It's very performative. I want to talk about AIDS because that was just consuming crisis in those years as well. And this is something I actually don't know, and I don't remember if you've covered it in your book. But how did the tabloids cover AIDS? I mean, I remember how the Times covered AIDS. Certainly, I could talk chapter and verse about that. But how did the tabloids?
Yeah, I mean, it was the New York Post covered AIDS like pretty aggressively, and it was a lot of fear mongering. So it was, it was a lot of stories about. I mean, they called it the AIDS time bomb. You know, it was sort of this idea that, and a lot of the, you know, in some ways this would become, this was foretold where our media would be many years later. But they questioned the scientific consensus on AIDS, I think that, and yet what's interesting is that, that when Larry Kramer created ACT UP in 1987, and really it was his fury with the fact that the world, the country, Washington, Koch were all paying so little attention to the crisis.
And Koch and Kramer lived in the same apartment building.
They would go on to live in the same.
Later, after Gracie Mansion.
Yeah. But Kramer really himself used the media, used the tabloids. So really, what happened was that the tabloids to some degree kind of ignored the crisis. Then the Post, I think, tapped into what was a kind of, largely irrational fear about how the disease could be transmitted,
and that it would be transmitted among the heterosexual population.
Yes, and there were parents who were refusing to send their kids to school because they were afraid that there was someone who was HIV positive in the school that their kids might get AIDS from, but then once ACT UP is born. There's the whole point of that organization was to get in the papers, and so all of their protests were deliberately as kind of confrontational and over the top as possible. The
die-ins, and then the action at St. Patrick's was a big deal.
Storming St. Patrick's Cathedral during Sunday morning mass. Protests at City Hall, protests down at the FDA where they sort of sealed off the entrance to the FDA so people couldn't go to work. That was all designed to get media attention.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a more nuanced or evolved understanding to come to, or not, about Koch's reticence to deal with the crisis? I mean, we all understand it now as, we think about it in terms of his closeted sexuality. Is there something else going on in that story? Was he fundamentally just a, conservative liberal, so to speak? I mean, what... what do you think? What conclusion did you come to?
Yes, so it's a complicated question and issue, but I think kind of what I came to believe was that, in the beginning, not only, there was the fact that he was in the closet, and sort of one of the most interesting things about working on this book was to be looking back on this years with the knowledge that he was gay, because it was not. So there was that, but he was also desperately trying to cut the city's budget. I mean, remember that he had kind of inherited the city
fiscal crisis,
right after the fiscal crisis. He did not want to spend money, and I think pretty early on, he could see that AIDS was going to be very expensive.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, nothing is more expensive than healthcare expenses for the city, and this in particular was an epidemic that played out over the course, or could play out over the course of many, months, days, months, even years. People would be in and out of the hospital. It was going to be very expensive. And also, I should say that, in addition to the AIDS in the gay community, it was also spreading very quickly
among
drug
users
and the
right.
homeless. So it was, this was not a population that had money to pay for
right.
private health care. So I think that was a factor also. And then I think what happened is that, Koch was incredibly stubborn and very defensive. And I think that once he felt that he was being kind of criticized for not doing enough, he just instinctively pushed back and was felt that he had to kind of hold his ground. So I think that and I do. I think, and in fact, I know from kind of listening to an interview that he gave with an oral history many years later, when he reflected back on that period of time, he had a lot of regrets about how he handled AIDS. He did, yeah. I mean, I think he would not have. I don't think he. I think I know that he wished that he had handled, in particular, like Larry Kramer and ACT UP differently. That he wished that he had met with Larry Kramer earlier, that he had, tried to tried to hear him. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. There are so many characters that came out of that period that are wildly famous now, as Harold mentioned. Who among who did you discover writing the book and thought, oh my gosh, this person, should be far better known, or had this monumental impact and most people don't know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the character whom I sort of came to I don't know, became sort of fondest of, who's I think sort of largely forgotten. Well, there are a couple. I mean, one I would say is Benjamin Ward, who is the sort of police commissioner during these years, who is the New York's first black police commissioner, who had the great misfortune of being appointed to this job just as crack cocaine was arriving in New York and crime was beginning to spike. But I also really came to love the story of Joyce Brown, or Billy Boggs, who is
amazing character.
Some of you may remember her. She was a homeless woman who was schizophrenic, who lived not far from here, actually, over by the Beekman Theater on the Upper East Side, and lived on a heating grate, and was not someone who was easy to miss, because she would sort of publicly defecate on the sidewalk. She would, when people gave her bills, she would set them on fire, and she was a character. And Koch, in this moment, decides, 1987, decides that he's had it up to here with the homeless, and particularly the homeless mentally ill, that he needs to get them off the street. And his lawyers tell him, well, you actually can't do that. You don't have the authority to take people, put people in the hospital against their will. And he says, well, please, find a way to
find
justify
a loophole,
this.
And let's run with it.
Yes, and they did. They found a loophole that was, at least kind of arguably legitimate. And Koch announces that he is going to start sweeping up the homeless, the mentally ill homeless, and putting them in a new wing in Bellevue. And so, of course, the ACLU, or the New York Civil Liberties Union, the NYCLU, gets wind of this. They go around the city and they give little blue flyers to all of the homeless people they can find, saying, if someone tries to hospitalize you against your will, call this number. And Koch decides, having gone out on some ride-arounds with his psychological health teams, he decides that this woman, whose name was Joyce Brown, she went by Billy Boggs.
And how old is she?
She was in her 40s at the time. he decides that she is going to be the first one. She's going to be the test case. And so the police and some social workers go out and pick her up. They bring her to Bellevue. They give her every manner of sedative they can find. She falls asleep, passes out, basically, for 24 hours. She wakes up, and she pulls out that little blue piece of paper, and she calls the New York Civil Liberties Union. And that thus begins this kind of incredible battle over her freedom. And she's represented by the New York Civil Liberties Union in a commitment hearing against the city. And it's all over the papers. And she testifies on her own behalf on the last day of her commitment hearing and gives this incredible performance where she's like totally lucid and thoughtful and funny. When she's asked, why do you burn dollar bills? She says, well, I don't want to get mugged. I want loose change. So she wins her freedom, remarkably. And as soon as she's released, she's on the Donahue Show, she's on 60 Minutes, she's literally invited to Harvard Law School.
To lecture,
to
right.
give a lecture. Yeah. And she gives a lecture on I was a political prisoner. She's a celebrity. Of course, it all kind of goes south once the headlines stop and she's refusing to take her medication.
And there's an interesting component with her family.
Her family,
right? Because she has a family that lives in the suburbs.
She has a group of sisters who live in New Jersey.
Right.
And they know exactly how this is going to go. They're refusing to give her checks, her welfare checks, right. Because they know that she's going to just blow them. And so her sisters essentially, sort of are aware that as soon as the cameras are off and the attention is gone, she's going to be, back where she was. And that is exactly what happens. She ends up kind of back in the street. But she certainly had her 20 minutes of fame.
Yeah. And that's just such a particularly resonant story because we still have not.
And we think about the Jordan Neely story.
The Jordan Neely story, we still have not figured out a way all these decades later.
Yeah.
If Zoran were reading the book, and I'm sure he has, or anybody entering politics now in this particular moment in the city, what were the most valuable lessons of that era that people should really hang on to? Yeah.
Well, first of all, if only he had if he had an FDR and a New Deal, he'd be all set.
Right, exactly.
I think to me the big and he seems to already kind of get this. The big takeaway for me, the big lesson is, the city was so eager, so desperate to after the fiscal crisis, after the kind of desperate days of the 70s, the city was so eager to get its economy moving again that it just gave a lot of power to private industry. It gave a lot of tax breaks, zoning waivers. It was basically like the real estate developers were kind of given the keys to the city. They could sort of do no wrong, and that is in part how we ended up with the homeless crisis, because of all of the SROs were turned into, luxury condominiums. So I think that there was a shift in power from the government to private industry. And I think that the lesson here is obviously you need the city's completely dependent on the tax revenues from
right.
the private industry. But the city also has to sort of keep some of the control itself. The city has to manage development. The city has to be more involved. I know, part of the backdrop for this book, of course, is the Reagan era, when we, kind of the beginning of the sort of war on government, the beginning of
and war on cities.
War on cities too.
Well, that starts with Nixon, but really it takes.
Yes. So this was not, this wasn't a time for kind of a strong government. But I think that the city gave away too much power during these
right.
years. And in many ways, the story of what happened to New York in the 4 decades since then, since the 80s, is private industry kind of running wild, and the government kind of, sacrificing all of its kind of leverage and power, and and the result of that is a lot of inequality and the affordability crisis that basically got Mamdani elected.
And we're still living with the repercussions of the fiscal crisis because the city has so little control of its budget, really.
Right,
I mean, in
right,
terms of all these things that Mamdani wants to do are so dependent on
that's right.
Hochul and the legislature, and that's all still coming out, that comes out of the 70s.
That's right, yeah.
I'm sure there are questions, so we'd like to open it up. Mr. Under 25 over here? Okay.
Thanks so much for your book. You really chose good characters to weave together into a narrative. Of course, there are space constraints. Was there a specific narrative or character, political figure, whoever, that you would have included if you had a bit more space?
Yeah. Yes. So what I wasn't able to do that I wish I had and I did try to do, but it just didn't quite work, was all the kind of cultural life of the city. In The Bronx is Burning, I was able to, because it was a shorter period of time, and a small, sort of a slightly kind of narrower lens. It was just kind of baseball and politics, and with sort of the Blackout and the Son of Sam thrown in, I was able to kind of get into, the music scene and some of the kind of cultural life of New York. Here I do write about, Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing, but I wasn't able to kind of get into, specifically like the art scene, which was, and, I actually wrote a lot of pages that I wasn't able to, I felt like I couldn't use on Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was so interesting, and he ODs during these years. And also, like, he was such a symbol of the explosion. He was an instant celebrity. The explosion of the art market during these years, and it was such a so much of because there was so much kind of wealth being generated on Wall Street. Quite a bit of it kind of spilled over into the art market, and the art world kind of migrated from Soho into the East Village, and so there was a sense of like it felt in a way kind of relevant to the story of these kind of boom years, but it was just ultimately a little too much because I already had so many different storylines, and it was it's a real balance with a kind of a book like this, because you feel like I had this whole cast of characters that I'm trying to kind of keep alive, and each one has to have their own, his or her own arc over the course of the book, and I'm moving from, homelessness to politics to crime, and it just was one thing too many. But if there were one thing that I wish I had found a way to include, it's probably that.
And there's a lot of hip hop that I'm sure.
There's hip hop too. Yes.
But I always found it very poignant that in 1987 we get the movie Wall Street and the death of Basquiat, which it's like the end of Bohemian New York, really, and the beginning of something else.
Yeah.
Sir, in the plaid shirt, you.
Thank you for the very fine talk. Was the actions of the ACLU ultimately harmful for Billy Boggs? The fact that they got so involved and she didn't get what she really needed to have?
Yeah. You could certainly argue that they were. Yeah. I think this is such a difficult question, and one that I guess I'm not even really. I don't know if anyone's qualified to answer this question, because it's an existential one. But it's sort of like, the argument was what really was. Was she considered a danger to herself or others? An imminent danger to herself or others. That was sort of what her hearing kind of hinged on, that question. And she certainly did not want to take her medication, and so she didn't once she was out of the hospital, and that meant that she was not living not living a life that anyone would envy. On the other hand, it is true that she didn't harm anyone else. She ultimately didn't harm herself. She just she did end up back on the street, doing drugs. But so I don't know. It's such a it's such a hard question. I don't know. What do you think? I mean,
I think they were too involved, and she didn't get what she should have had.
what do you think she should have?
I don't know the case closely, but obviously she needed medication. I don't know the case closely, but obviously it sounds like she didn't get medications, and as you said, she wasn't living the life that maybe she could have had.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but the problem is she just, I don't know, she didn't like the life she had as like a medicated schizophrenic. I mean, she didn't want to be that person either. So,
Tough question.
I don't know. Yeah.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
Sam.
Okay. One thing you didn't cover here, but you cover in your book, you open with the scandal of 1986, which badly wounded Ed Koch.
Yeah.
I'm a veteran of that. I was the only one left in the agency, and that's how I got my promotion. I was the only one that was not jailed.
Wait, you were in the Parking Violations Bureau?
I was in the Department of Transportation.
Oh, okay. All right.
And the only one that voted against the Wellsback, machine, the phony machine on it.
Yeah.
But during your research, did you ever come across a code word that the bribers use to get civil servants to do something that they might not do? I know Harold knows that word because he was in government.
No.
No.
What is that?
I'll tell you what Donald Manis's last words to me were, Sam, I have a contract for you. If they said the word contract, and Tony Amoruso used to use it,
Yeah.
and others, it meant it would be improper for you to even ask about it. It comes from the highest levels. Don't question it. A contract meant that's the end.
Okay.
Do it.
That feels very kind of mafioso.
It was very mafioso. We had the bosses. I assumed when he said the highest level, it wasn't Ed Koch and it wasn't God. It was Pete Esposito.
Wait, Sam, I have a question for you. Who should be the new DOT commissioner?
That's a good question.
You'll email me.
Yacht Hingley, to me, is someone who's got the talent, the skills. I want somebody with a backbone. I'd like to see DOT get enforcement back. If you remember,
Yeah.
DOT had enforcement until Giuliani took it, and right now there's no real scientific enforcement out there.
Okay.
But I can go on and on about
Okay.
that.
So thank you. I apologize. I'm only halfway through the book, so I don't know if you addressed the 1989 charter revision, and I'm wondering, given that you didn't, what your sense is of how the events you talk about in the book change city government and what unexpected repercussions there are that we're dealing with now in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Sam is right to sort of bring up the corruption scandals, which weakened Koch, and also I think helped weaken faith in the city government, it also in turn kind of led to the charter revision and the end of the Board of Estimate and all that. And I think, I do think that it also speaks to that kind of larger theme that I was getting at earlier when Jeannie asked about the lesson for Mamdani, which is just that, we just went through this. It was this moment when there was just every reason to kind of lose faith in government. And, and particularly for New York after the fiscal crisis and like the kind of gross mismanagement, and then you had a president in Washington who was saying that the 8 scariest words in the English language are I'm from the government and I'm here to help, and then I think that the Koch scandals just sort of kind of played into that kind of that loss of faith, and so that I think in a way that if you certainly Eric Adams has sort of kept that alive, that tradition alive. But I think that that the this kind of skepticism toward like what government's even capable of is now like pretty deeply rooted in like our culture, and in some ways I think that Bloomberg like was kind of technocratic as he was pretty effective at kind of restoring a certain kind of faith in the city, though it was done in a kind of like patriarchal way, I think, with him. But I think that that's going to be really, to me, the central test for Mamdani is sort of whether he can, convince, whether he can, practically speaking, whether he can do it, whether he will be able to sort of, can the city get back into the act of building? Is that something the city is capable of doing? But also, can he get people to sort of believe in government as like a force, not only a force for good, but a force that can like kind of bring about real change. Because in New York, it's private industry that has done most of the work here. And that, of course, the period of time that that Harold began talking about with Fiorello LaGuardia, that was a totally different time. That was when the city, LaGuardia would drive around the city on Sundays looking for things that the city needed. What can we build for New York? What does New York need? It's been a very different story since then, and I think that it's going to be interesting to see whether Mamdani can kind of shift that balance again. He's going to have to, I think.
In the back.
Thank you very much. Does the idealism as well as the failures of the Lindsay administration, as chronicled in an earlier book, The Ungovernable City, offer any lessons for the 4 years in your book and the incoming administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, in some ways, certainly in my book, in Gods of New York, what I think what we had in those Lindsay years, and these were the late '60s. I mean, this was the moment when cities, around the country were exploding, right? Riots in Newark and Detroit and elsewhere, and the city was kind of largely escaped, kind of unharmed during those years, and it was partly a tribute to Lindsay, certainly. I think in many ways what happened to Newark in the '80s was happened, I should say in many ways, at least in part because it hadn't happened in the '60s. There was a lot of kind of unresolved stuff in the city, racial stuff in the city, so I would say there's certainly like a direct connection there. In terms of the ungovernability, I mean, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, certainly it was, I think the Lindsay years were what really began to sort of set up the fiscal crisis, and people just weren't aware. No one knew what was going on. I mean, it's, that's sort of the great sort of story of Drop Dead City, right? Yeah. Is this idea that the city is borrowing against money it doesn't have, and no one seems to mind.
Exactly.
And so I do think that, Lindsay did kind of tee up a lot of these problems that kind of left at the feet of Abe Beame ultimately.
Right.
And that Lindsay wasn't ever really blamed for them, I don't think. Yeah.
And also in the way that, just the flip side of that, it's like Dinkins never gets enough credit for bringing crime down. It all goes to Giuliani.
Right.
We have time for 2 more questions. Sir.
So I grew up in New York, and I always have this argument with people who've moved here. Do you find the city to be better now than it was prior to 1986?
Better, certainly in some ways. I mean, I think, if you think about, I mean, well, just to take one example, I mean, when after Yusuf Hawkins' murder, Al Sharpton, who again was just a rabble-rousing civil rights activist at the time, took a couple busloads, a few hundred black people into the neighborhood of Bensonhurst, where Yusuf Hawkins had been killed, an Italian-American white neighborhood, to just march through the streets. and they were the most vile things were shouted at them. People held up watermelons. A bride and groom who were getting married literally came out of the church to come scream at them, and then Koch, mayor at the time, said you shouldn't. Blacks shouldn't be marching in Bensonhurst, and then you move forward in time to 5 years ago after George Floyd, and you have a very different situation. The protests were diverse, et cetera. I mean, whatever you think of them, So certainly, I think as a kind of on the race side, the city is certainly better. Also, I would say that Koch felt that whether he was right or wrong, he felt that he couldn't come out of the closet because it would have killed his political career. I think that would no longer be the case today. Having said those things, I do think a lot about what I mentioned earlier, and the thing that I feel kind of most sort of nostalgic about, and I feel like that the city has lost, is this sense of a kind of a civic culture in New York, of a sort of single fabric, that the city feels that people kind of care about the city, and that they recognize that the city isn't just a place to live, that it's like an idea that we believe in, and that's why we're here, and that we want the city to be a better place, a fairer place. I feel like there was an investment in New York as something more than just a great place to live for the wealthy because the restaurants were good, and I think we've kind of lost that. I mean, I do think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years, because I think that the promise of Mamdani is that he is going to kind of reactivate that. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
If you like hearing nonfiction authors talk about their work, you should check out our America's Book Club podcast. Every week, author and philanthropist David Rubenstein talks with leading authors and cultural figures about their ideas and works. Find America's Book Club wherever you get your podcasts.